morning. My name is Jean Tirole, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conference on the economics of energy and climate change. For some of you, it might be the first time. For some others, it might be the 11th time. Time flies, but we all hope that you'll enjoy the program, which was prepared. We have prepared. I mean, when I say we, it's Thomas-Olivier Lahautier, Claude Cramp, and Stéphane Ambec, who have worked very hard on this. The format of the conference changes from one year to the next, depending on the submissions we get, depending on the topical things, and I'm glad that our American president made it even more topical, at least Dick's lecture. And depends also on the submission. So for this conference, we have selected 35 papers. 2 of them are presented in plenary sessions and the rest in pilot sessions. This year is a bit special because we don't have a roundtable with practitioners. The reason for that is that on Thursday, next Thursday, there is a forum in Paris, an energy forum in Paris that we organize with professionals. So this 2007 edition is not going to be with a roundtable, so it's a little bit more academic than usual. So in any case, in name of the organizers, the scientific committee, many of you are here, thanks, and the local organizers, let me thank the speakers, participants, panelists who have accepted to participate. A couple of practical matters. The conference will take place in this room, which is the amphitheater Gaverny, and 2 other rooms, Corde and Pic du Midi Lourdes. I hope you remember the names, which are this way? Well, there are some, they're on this floor anyway. Okay, one is there, and the other, yeah, I'm sure you'll find it's not very, it's very small, so for the pilot sessions. The coffee breaks and lunch you have already seen just in front of the room. And dinners will be at 8 p.m. at Espace EDF Bazac, thanks EDF. This Bazac place is actually an historical place. It's along the River Garonne, and it's the first joint stock company which is known. It was created in 1372. It was a grain milling company. And it's very famous because we have the records of transactions since 1372. So it's actually a very, very interesting place for that reason too. Now let me move on to this keynote lecture, and we are very, very, very happy to begin this conference with a lecture by Richard Schmalensee, who, as you all know, is a well-known expert in the domain of electricity economics and more generally in industrial organization. Dick is co-chairman of the Board of Governors of the Asia School of Business, the Howard W. Johnson Professor of Management and Economics, Emeritus at MIT, and he served for 9 years from 1998 through 2007 as the Dean of the MIT Sloan School of Management. And there he had a very decisive influence for the business school, by cleaning up its finances, especially setting up an incentive scheme and its agency relationship with the institute as a whole, basically setting the stage for a new period for the business school, raising funds for the magnificent new building. I kept going every year to his office, the dean's office, and he had this map of the new campus, and it was delayed, and Dick actually pursued it and did it, and he made it. That was great. And of course, he adapted the business school to the new challenge of the new economy and entrepreneurship. Dick was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 through 1991 and served for 12 years as director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. He's a co-author or author of 12 books, including 4 books on multi-sided markets in the last 12 years. Not bad. The last one was last year, Matchmakers, the New Economics of Multi-Sided Platforms, which actually recently came out in French. for those of you who want to read it in French, and over 120 published articles. I don't have to tell you what he has done research on, just in case, one never knows. His research has been centered on industry organization, IO, and its application to managerial and public policy issues, with particular emphasis on antitrust, regulatory, energy, and environmental policy. I mean, he has worked on almost every industry you might think of. Is there an industry you haven't worked on? That's one, okay, you'll tell us about that. And of course, very relevant to his lecture was his work on the Clean Air Act amendment, the SO2 market, the acid rain stuff in the US, and also he has worked very early on climate change, global warming, so it was very prescient. Dick Schmalensee is a fellow of the Econometric Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was a 2012 Distinguished Fellow of the Industrial Organization Society. I have to let you speak. He has served on the Executive Committee of the American Economic Association. He has been director of the International Securities Exchange and other corporations. He is currently a director of the International Data Group and of the National Bureau of Economic Research and chairman of the board of directors of Resources for the Future. Next year we should have someone with a shorter CV. I suggest. Let me conclude with a personal note. When I went to MIT as a PhD student, I knew almost no economics, and I knew there was something called general equilibrium, fixed price equilibrium, and optimal taxation, but for the rest, I didn't know what there were other fields around. And I certainly didn't know what the phrase industrial organization was. And actually, at MIT, you take 2 majors and 2 minors, and IO was not one of the 4. I didn't take IO as a field. But one day in the corridor, I met with my classmate, Drew Fudenberg, and Drew told me, there's this very interesting field which is being taught by Dick Schmalensee and Paul Josko, and it's called industrial organization, and maybe you should learn a little bit about it. And of course, I did comply with what Drew recommended. And so I started learning some IO, again, not for my thesis, but nonetheless, I wrote IO papers with Drew, and we regularly went to see Dick in his office. We were not his students, we were not his advisors, and nonetheless, he spent a lot of time with us on, you may remember the learning by doing paper and the capital accumulation preemption paper, and other things as well, and he was very generous. Later on, I had the honor to be on the faculty and a colleague of Dick, and I kept being fascinated by the fact that he had so much time for his colleagues and students, despite the fact that he had a very successful, extremely successful academic career. So Dick knows what I owe him and Paul Josko, and this is a good opportunity to thank him publicly for that. Well, today we are very grateful that Dick accepted to deliver this keynote lecture, and he will be speaking about near-term policy priorities to enable deep decarbonization. Thank you, Dick.
Let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me thank Jean for that extraordinarily long, of course, and kind introduction. I have one small anecdote to match. He complimented me on, or thanked me for being generous with my time. I will never forget when Jean and Drew walked into my office one day and said, well, we have this paper and you should be a co-author. It was the Fat Cats and Puppy Dogs paper. And I said, but I didn't write the paper. They said, no, but it comes from an idea that you gave us that we had, and I found that extraordinarily generous. People don't normally do that, walk into your office and say, please sign here as a co-author, even though you didn't actually work out anything. So I declined, which was probably a mistake. It's a very nice paper. So this is intended as an easy introduction to the conference. This is I'm sure the least technical talk you're going to hear. many of the things I'm going to say you have heard before many times. My goal here is not to present new theorems or new empirical results, but to try to get you to think about policies related to climate change in a slightly different way. The key word there is priorities. Most of what I'm going to suggest needs to be done, we all know needs to be done. The question is, how important is it? And how important is it relative to other things? So first, let's talk about deep decarbonization. Again, you've probably seen this. It's from a 2009 paper by my colleague Susan Solomon and co-authors. Results have been replicated since with other models. The top graph shows CO2 concentrations moving along basically the 20th century path of emissions, and then in the experiments stopping here, stopping there, stopping there. And by stopping, I mean going to zero emissions. So what happens is there's a decline over the course of somewhat less than a century, and then a slow decline thereafter as the processes become geological in time scale. So CO2 concentrations decline slowly. The surprise, again, it's been replicated, is the bottom graph, which is the climate increment due to that CO2. Remember, there's zero emissions going on here, stays constant for 1,000 years and more. And the climate scientists say, well, it's pretty clear why that happens. As the CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere, warming is reduced, but because warming has occurred, the ocean is warmer and less able to offset the ongoing warming, so those two forces balance, and it's roughly constant over 1,000 years and more. That says what we put into the air both between now and whenever we get to net zero emissions will have impacts for 1,000 years and more. That's beyond your grandchildren and my grandchildren. That's a long time. So that suggests it's rather important to get to zero rather quickly. And I will say one of the recent experiences I've had that has pushed me to think about the long term is I was on a U.S. National Academies panel focused on how the social cost of carbon should be estimated. And when you think about that, exactly how you would do it mechanically, you begin to think in terms of centuries. Because if you're going to have that kind of temperature impact, the question is, what does that get discounted back to, and how big is the economy, and what are the damages way out? And the short answer is we don't know, and that's either reassuring or frightening, depending on your point of view. So when I said deep decarbonization, there are a lot of studies. This is an example of a graph put out by the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, and they sort of all say the same thing. You decarbonize energy supply, you use electricity supply rather, you use electricity for more things, and you become more efficient in energy use generally. Usually these studies focus on technical possibility. Usually they don't go much beyond mid-century. But that's not zero by 2050, and this is the hard part. Even though, again, there's no focus in this on policies. How might you do that? Might it matter how you do that? And I'm going to argue it would matter how you do that. Again, and by the way, compared to the previous graph, this time scale is minute, right? 2050 is 33 years from now. That's nothing. Most of you will still be active professionally. At that point, many of you at least, will still be active professionally at that point. Certainly your children will, certainly your grandchildren will. That's not far off compared to, say, 1,000 years. And it doesn't get to zero. Again, one of the, just to again tell you how I got to this point, I chaired an interdisciplinary study at MIT that came out in 2015. It took a lot of years to do. It was on the future of solar energy. It took us several years to figure out what's the most important question about the future of solar energy. And we came to the conclusion that the most important question about the future of solar energy is, what do you need to do to make it more likely that it can help here? Having a little more solar between now and 2020 is nice. Getting to zero is really critical. And getting to zero means more than taking today's technology and making it a little cheaper. I assert that. That was one of our conclusions. So, again, I want to think about beyond 2050. Now, a natural reaction, and these studies rarely focus on policy design or political economy, and I'm going to say a little bit about both. Now, particularly in light of the recent actions in Washington, it's natural to focus attention on the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is important. I would like to apologize publicly for the President of the United States, as I find myself doing every time I leave the United States. But it is very important, obviously, to make Paris work. Paris is a pledge and review mechanism, which we used to call, or name and shame, which is people make pledges, you review whether they've done it, and it's set up to do that, to do stock taking and dialogue, and it's important to make it work, but Paris doesn't get us there. Paris, even if everybody keeps their commitments on reasonable projections, Paris doesn't even start emissions down. So Paris is a good start, Paris is an essential start, Paris is historic, but you can't just focus on Paris. And the reason, and this is sort of the thesis of the lecture, how we do it will have implications for the cost of going beyond it. And the cost of going beyond it, the cost of getting to zero or near zero, will influence the probability or the speed, depending on how you'd like to think about it, that it gets done. The cheaper it is to get carbon out of the system, the more likely as a political matter, as an economic matter, that it will happen. Today's policy choices can affect that. And there are three ways, one of which is obvious, one of which is almost obvious, and one of which is close to obvious. The first is investment decisions we make now will affect the state of the economy, emissions, and so forth beyond 2050. That has to do with things like power plant design, of course, but it also has to do with things like urban layout, public transportation, and a range of long-lived assets that will be around after 2050. I'm in one of the newer buildings in my neighborhood. It's coming on to 100 years old. It has a heating system that is by any standards antique, and replacing it would be astronomically expensive. So what we do now in terms of investments will matter beyond 2050. The second reason why today's policies matter is that, as I'm going to spend a little time talking about, technology will matter. Technology will matter a lot about the cost of getting to zero, the speed of getting to zero. Technologies, particularly energy-producing and energy-using technologies, take a while to develop, take a while to bring to market, and take a while to penetrate. So the technologies, if we're going to have different technologies after 2050 than we have now, fundamentally different, it becomes a priority to develop them. And finally, I want to talk about policy inertia. Policy architecture, the basic way in which policy problems are approached, tend to persist. You can talk about what's architectural and what's implementation in details, but an example with which people are familiar after the last US election is the Electoral College, which was a policy choice made in 1789 that made sense in 1789, makes no sense today, and is, as a political matter, irreversible. I will give you another example, which is a little more positive. I was on the Council of Economic Advisors when negotiations began toward a framework convention on climate change. The US, try to remember this, the US, in a Republican administration, hosted the first negotiating session leading up to the framework convention. In the diplomatic traffic before that first meeting, we received basically architectural statements. The convention should contemplate protocols that would deal with specific pieces of equipment. Well, this is sort of the way US environmental policy has worked, the way I think European environmental policy has largely worked. Impose standards, either device standards or performance standards on various kind of equipment, mileage standards on automobiles, emission standards on power plants, and so forth. And the proposal was that the Framework Convention should be followed by protocols of that sort. There would be an automobile protocol to be negotiated internationally, a power plant protocol to be negotiated internationally, or, as we said internally, a toaster protocol to be negotiated internationally. The US proposed, since we had just done the acid rain program, the US proposed that we move rather toward a global emissions trading system. Now, we lost that, mostly, but what stuck was a focus on national emissions instead of efficiency standards or device standards. And I would argue that architectural choice that the world community has made, that negotiations are now about national emissions and not about specific technologies, has been a very fruitful one, and one that I hope will be hard to reverse. So that's what I mean by an architectural choice. Another one is the way the US subsidizes solar power is we subsidize investment in solar power using tax revenues. That's a terrible policy. I could go on at length about why that's a bad way to subsidize anything, but we're almost certainly stuck with it. It keeps getting renewed because there are interests that investment banks make money on it, certain solar installers make money on that design, and it's very hard to move off it to something more sensible. Once policy structures are put in place, they tend to persist. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of my time on three challenges that I think are important in this context and that have implications for near-term priorities. The first is the South, so to speak. These are global CO2 emissions, and you'll notice they're not turning down. And the fundamental reason they're not turning down in the globe, they are in Europe and Eurasia, in part because of the fall of the Soviet Union. They're pretty flat in North America, turning down a little bit if you have a magnifying glass, and growing in other places because they want to get rich the same way the North got rich, burning fossil fuels. They may burn them more efficiently. They may bypass the stage of burning wood and going straight to burning coal, which is mixed, but that's a challenge. And let me scope how large a challenge that is. This is contrasting what the IMF calls the 39 advanced economies and the rest of the world, which I'll call ROW. The advanced economies are about 42% of global GDP, about 15% of population, and about 32% of emissions. You can do the arithmetic, and you get emissions per dollar of GDP are 1.56 times as high as in advanced economies, and GDP per capita about 22%. That shouldn't say G7, it should say AE for advanced economies from an earlier draft. So run an experiment. Suppose they control like crazy and take emissions per dollar of GDP down to the advanced economy average. That's dramatic. That's dramatic control, but they grow. And they only grow to the GDP half that of the advanced economies. Nothing else happens. No population growth, no growth in the rest of the world. Emissions go up by almost 40%. Well, you can do scenarios and models and all of this stuff, but that, I think, is a fundamental problem. Poor countries want to grow. The way we know how to grow, and they know how to grow, is burn fossil fuels, switch from animal power, switch from wood, burn fossil fuels. And if they grow, even if they reduce their CO2 intensity, reasonable growth gets you substantial growth in emissions, all else equal, when you need decline. So, they can't get rich the way we did. They just can't. And the question is, okay, what do? Well, you can't say don't get rich, right? You don't say to the Chinese, yeah, we know you pulled 300 million people out of dire poverty, but no more, please, no more. Well, that's not going to work, and the Indians would like to replicate that. They must follow a much less carbon-intensive path than we did. What's that path look like? We don't know. I mean, that's just straightforward. We don't know. Build a lot of nuclear plants? Well, good luck with that. Use more hydro? Well, we used a lot of hydro early on. So it's a little unclear. And the one thing that I think is obvious is that pressures for growth in emerging economies will persist and will be strong and will be hard to resist. And it's going to be hard to persuade them to massively spend more money for energy and spend more money on energy efficiency than we do and slow their growth. Again, this is sort of where we got when we did the solar study, was we said, this stuff is more expensive. Yes, in Saudi Arabia with cheap labor from someplace it may be almost competitive, but most places, today's solar technology with heavy solar panels and brackets and wires and all of that attendant equipment and inverters is more expensive than burning fossil fuels most places. So why would you say, gee, here's what we'd like you to do. We'd like you to put aside fossil fuels and do a lot of this more expensive technology. It seems, once you think about it, that they need another path forward, and they need another path forward that's not only technically feasible, but economically reasonable, that requires new technologies. And as I said a little while ago, new technologies in the energy space take a long time to develop, bring to market, and penetrate. If you buy that, you buy developing those technologies as a policy priority today. Not necessarily for our use. Rich countries can afford to spend a little more on energy. Our pressures for growth are not that great. We're not trying to pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty within our borders. But in the developing world, the pressures for growth are intense. And why would we not try to make it possible for growth, which after all does alleviate poverty, and CO2 emissions reductions to coexist? That, I submit, requires new technologies. And it requires not just government R&D, of course, because government isn't really good. Governments anywhere aren't very good at developing commercially competitive technologies. That requires a mix, usually, of fundamental research and a market pull to take that research into commercial technologies. That is to say, there has to be a market for something based on somebody's clever patent, for somebody's clever patent to be made into a product. So you need both, but you need fundamentally work on new technologies that will be competitive in the emerging world. Solar technologies are one of them, obviously. Second challenge, all the deep decarbonization studies talk about decarbonizing electricity. That will not be easy. Okay, fossil fuels are about 2/3 of world electricity supply. The first thing to do to decarbonize, which we're doing in the US, for reasons having nothing to do, of course, with Paris, is switching coal to gas. And if you do it globally, you switch all the coal to gas, you cut emissions by about 20%. And if you look at the US EIA forecast, that's about 1 decade's growth in global generation. So switching the world from coal to gas, an obvious decarbonization step, buys you 10 years, maybe. It is at best a short bridge, and a bridge that's more attractive in some places, like the US with cheap gas, than in Europe with expensive gas. So where do you go to deep decarbonization? Well, maybe you do nuclear, but I have to say, and I don't have the advantage of having looked at world public opinion polls, but there is widespread opposition to doing a lot of nuclear in many places of the world. And this graph shows nuclear generation, and you can see there's Fukushima. And it's just not zipping right along here as if the world is going to nuclear. This is hydro, on this graph, and you can see increasing use of hydro in some regions with stability in regions that have already built what they're going to build. And hydro is terrific stuff. Geothermal is terrific. Municipal waste and all those things are fine, but limited. Fusion, if we could ever do fusion, I wonder what it would cost. I had a colleague for some years who was the apostle of hot, dry rock. If only we could drill down far enough, there's plenty of heat, we could make steam, it would be great, but we can't drill down far enough. So, there are all these things that could happen. Biofuels, by the way, are hard to do at scale. If you think about a big forest and transport and all of that, the economics don't work. Carbon capture and storage, or storage and utilization and storage depending on, sequestration and utilization, however it's acronymed these days, is basically untried, very expensive, and really, if you're deeply decarbonizing, makes sense mostly with gas. And carbon capture and storage with gas is a tricky business because it's not that carbon-rich an exhaust stream. So what are you going to do? I mean, if you're going to have a deeply decarbonized electric system and you're not going to use a lot of nuclear power, which I think is a reasonable forecast, I'd like to be wrong, is that it's wind and solar. Big resources, growing rapidly, of course, with subsidies. This is non-hydro renewables by region. It's from, as all of these are, from the BP report. And you can see, globally, non-hydro renewables, I think this is the global, or this is the global, I forget which, but non-hydro renewables are growing rapidly, becoming important, but not dominant. Not dominant, and in many systems, they are problematic. I have a son living in Hawaii, so I follow developments in Hawaii with more than usual attention, and Hawaii has a lot of rooftop solar. And Hawaii has a lot of problems with rooftop solar because you can't control rooftop solar. So they put a limit on new installations. They basically, a lot of times, curtail the utilities own solar, as well as everything else, to deal with the flow from the neighborhoods. And that's like 10% of generation from rooftop solar. Go to a system that is dominated with wind and solar. That's wind and solar except for dealing with issues, and you say, well, boy, it would be really nice to do cheap carbon capture and storage, because then we could have some gas plants standing around to deal with variability. That would be handy in a deeply decarbonized system. We don't know how to do that. We certainly don't know how to do it at reasonable cost. It would also be nice to have bulk storage. And I have a physicist colleague who describes breakthroughs as tooth fairies and says cheap bulk storage is about 4 tooth fairies away. And so you can count on it, and some people in battery companies say it's close, but I think the general assessment is it's at least a couple of tooth fairies away, and it isn't going to happen automatically. It isn't going to happen automatically. If we're going to have cheap carbon capture and sequestration to deal with a wind-solar dominated system, or we're going to have cheap bulk storage to deal with such a system, that's going to be a policy priority now. I would also say, and this is, of course, now I preach the usual gospel of economics, that you got to get the prices right in the power system. If you don't have the prices right, and you're pushing that system hard to decarbonize, and you're making lots of investments, if you don't get the price system right, you're going to waste money and make it more expensive. So why don't you do demand response? That requires having real-time pricing and smart systems and automated meters and all the usual stuff. Why don't you do subsidies more rationally than most of us do them now? I hate to say this in Europe, but why don't you move to LMPs? Why don't you kind of go with the laws of physics and do localized marginal prices? Why don't you remove the extra subsidies to rooftop generation that many of us have? And you say, wait a minute, why do we want to do that? It's not controllable, it's more expensive, it's not as efficient. Why are we subsidizing it more? None of these things matter much now. Why don't you make, just to finish my story, why don't you enable storage, because you're going to have market rules that let storage participate, that let distributed generators participate, not just dump power. And you have to have some way to have flexible capacity available, whether it's capacity markets or some other trick. But think about 80, 90% wind and solar. Huge variation in supply, demand, who knows. That's a very different system than what we have now. That's a system in which you really do need prices to work, to operate efficiently, to have investment efficiently. Now, I say it's a policy priority now because these things aren't easy to change. We're having ferocious fights in the United States over net metering where you recover the fixed cost of the grid through per kilowatt hour charges. Made no difference, really, in the old days. People who use more electricity pay more of the fixed cost. That makes sense. Now, people who put on solar roofs pay a lot less of the fixed costs. People get very upset. That's clearly a bad design. It will take us a long time to sort this out, and the fight is on now. So if you don't start on some of these other things, the price systems are not going to be right by 2050. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to be harder than it needs to be to decarbonize. That's the second challenge. The third challenge is that electricity supply is the easy part. We talk about decarbonizing electricity supply because as a technical matter, we sort of know how to do this. We have low carbon or carbon-free generation technologies. Let's just use more of them. Well, that's less than half of CO2 emissions. This is 2010 EIA graph. You've got transport. Oh, we'll all use electric vehicles. Okay, in India and China and Indonesia and Pakistan. Okay, and then there's that 20.4% from industries and construction. That's a lot of different kinds of sources. And then there's residential. My 100-year-old heating system. We put in a nice new efficient gas burner, but it's a very inefficient pumped hot water system, which there's not much to do until all the pipes fail, which, will happen. How do you fix all of those sources? Now, what most of us tend to do, by us I mean our nations, tend to have source-specific policies, right? We regulate auto emission standards, whether it's miles per gallon in the US way, where we like the old units of measurement for unknown reasons, or whether it's grams of CO2 per 100 kilometers. We impose efficiency programs. California has a low carbon fuel standard to try to control the carbon content of motor vehicle fuels. We have a lot of policies. But there are a lot of different sources. So once you've gotten through the easy part, the 40-some% that's electricity, how do you get the rest of it down? And this is not including land use. And I will just say parenthetically, in case I forget to say it later on, land use requires significant attention. We're busy preserving Forest A, preserving the mahogany in Forest A without affecting the demand for mahogany. So mahogany gets cut down in Forest B, and we all feel good about protecting Forest A, but we're just putting more demand on the forest that's not protected. So we really don't have land use, a good handle on land use as far as I can tell, and land use is important. So Mike, I now again preach to the choir. We all know that a carbon tax or a cap and trade are the best ways to deal with all these diverse sources. We don't have to have a toaster rule and a motor vehicle rule and a rule for old heating systems and a rule for new heating systems. We just say, look, you use carbon-based fuels, you pay more. You want to pay less, use less. We know that. We were all taught that. But our countries don't do that. Right? I mean, the EU emissions trading system, the California system have low prices. Frank's on a very nice recent paper, Frank Wallach is on a very nice recent paper that says California knew that. Basically, California knew that their cap and trade system would have low prices because all the other policies would constrain emissions sufficiently that the cap really wouldn't be binding. And why would you do a thing like that? Well, you do a thing like that because as a political matter, we like policies with concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, right? So we regulate we raise electricity prices or we raise taxes broadly to subsidize something we like, renewables. What a fabulous thing. Low carbon fuels, what a fabulous thing. We like to subsidize those things. The notion that we're going to have a very visible tax that hits people hard is unpopular, full stop, even if you rebate it. Even if you rebate it. So as a political economy matter, this is just really difficult. But again, I would argue that if you look down the road, beyond 2050, certainly well beyond Paris, this is really important stuff. We have to find a way to break this habit. We have to move away from the toaster protocol approach to the world and get to a price system. I don't have a recipe for this. I think it's hard politically, but what you get is, as an economic matter, if you impose a bunch of other constraints that affect carbon emissions and those constraints are binding, then those constraints will affect the pattern of emissions reductions. And they can only raise the cost of emissions reductions. And raising the cost of emissions reductions makes it less likely that society will push those reductions. So the question is, how do we move now to move away from ancillary policies and toward more reliance on carbon pricing? I think that's economically important. I think it's important for getting deep decarbonization done. I don't have a prescription for it. I'm only an economist. But it seems to be the economic logic is pretty straightforward. I told you this was going to be the simplest talk you would hear in these 2 days. I think the logic is absolutely straightforward. So let me go to conclusions. I think when you think about climate, it is really important to take the long view because climate is a long-term problem. And fixing our influence on climate is a long-term problem. It's not a let's see what we can do in 10 years. It's let's see how we can set the stage for getting the job done over a half century and more. Because if we set the stage wrong today, I think it'll be very hard to get the job done in the long run. For reasons of asset durability, for reasons of the time to develop technology, and last, for reasons of policy inertia. If you don't get the policy architecture right, it will be hard to change. The longer it's in place, the harder it is to change. In order to make deep decarbonization politically acceptable, politically compatible with growth, particularly in emerging economies, we've got to give them another path to follow. We don't have that path. That's got to be a priority. That's got to be a priority. When you say to India, don't burn all that coal, you got to have something palatable to do instead. We don't have it now. It'd be nice to have it in 20 years. If you really imagine a deeply, deeply decarbonized electric system, which you need to get to stop changing climate, it's likely to be dominated by wind and solar. We don't know how to operate an electric power system in which almost all the generation comes from wind and solar. That would be a good thing to know how to do. The one thing we do know is that if we have the prices wrong, we're going to get investments wrong, and whatever that system looks like, it's going to be screwed up if we have prices wrong en route to it. We will also need to figure out technologies. And finally, a broader problem really is, and it's a political economy problem, politicians don't trust markets, politicians want belts and suspenders, politicians don't like high carbon prices. That has to be attacked, because if it doesn't change, the cost of reducing emissions is going to be higher than it needs to be, and emissions reductions are going to be less likely to occur than they should. I'll stop there. Thank you.